Hi, I'm William Stewart, co-founder of Teleios. Welcome back to our verse-by-verse study on the book of Mark. We are at the end of chapter 7. Christ is making his way through various regions and has been in Galilee to the north of Jerusalem. Again, I think he was doing this for security reasons, as not to disturb as much as possible the leadership of the Jews who wanted to charge him with sedition and complain to him with the Roman authorities, who would be afraid of any sort of king, even if it's spiritual, and with the hope then they would put him to death. And of course, they will ultimately succeed in doing this. Today, we start on a new part of his ministry. Remember, Christ came to the Jews first that they would repent and consider him Messiah for the salvation of their souls and the coming of the promised kingdom from the Old Testament. And they rejected this. So today Christ moves to the area of the Gentiles. Now the Gentiles, I think, have already been following him to some extent around the Sea of Galilee because there were Gentiles there. But here he moves to a region specifically that is almost all Gentiles. And this really is consistent with the Old Testament, which says that the Gentiles will be included in the future promises of God. So read at the end of Hosea 1, Hosea 2, I believe Isaiah 11:10, Isaiah 65:1. So it's pretty prominent. And so here he, in his mercy, goes to the Gentiles. Let's look at verse 24. He moves to the borders of Tyre and Sidon. Of course, these were famous cities along the Mediterranean coast. He entered a house. There was a young daughter there with an unclean spirit, and a woman fell at his feet. So she's called a Syrophoenician by nation, and she asked him if she could cast out that devil. So remember, we've talked about that there was appears to have been increased demonic activity at the time of Christ as Satan tries to stop Christ from doing his work against him and ending his power, and probably to scare the people away from him as well. Jesus said to her, verse 27, let the children first be filled, for it is not meet or correct or right to take the children's bread and cast it to the dogs. So by this, Christ means by the children, the Jews. And it's not right to take what was meant for them and cast it to those unworthy. I think Christ is saying this to test her. But she responded, yet the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. And for this he said, go thy way, the devil is gone from your daughter. So he sees her faith and her persistence, and he heals the daughter. And the devil went out. So then in verse 31, a second Gentile story. He returned to Galilee, but went over to the area of the Decapolis. So these are 10 cities to the east of the Sea of Galilee. They were developed. It's hard for me to know exactly who did this. I think it was Augustus, soon after Pompey took this area militarily around 63 BC. And then Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, starting in 29 BC, though he had a power before this, I think developed these cities. That's why inference, I don't know a specific quote that says this. They were there to be Greek cities, to spread Greek culture in this area. And he found a man who was deaf and who had an impediment in speech. Of course, if you can't hear, it's hard to speak correctly. So we don't know exactly what the ailment was and if it was primary to the ears and to speaking, or perhaps just the ears. But he put his hands upon him. He did some maneuvers and basically told him in his mouth to be open. And using the word ephphatha, it comes from the Hebrew fatah, meaning open. And his ears were open, and his tongue was loosened, and he spoke again. So again, this is another miracle. It's consistent with, again, prophecy showing Christ's compassion and his messiahship. So read Isaiah 35:5, Isaiah 53 verses 3 and 5, and Isaiah 61 verses 1 and 2. Good prophecies to show this. He said, again, tell no man. And after many of his miracles, he said this. Again, I think he, at this point, having been rejected by the Jewish nation, is ministering under the radar. So he's trying to train his disciples, show himself to people who might believe out in the rural areas, still tangling with the Pharisees when he needs. So, and they were all astonished in verse 37. He hath done all things well, and making both the deaf to hear and the dumb to speak. Okay, so what have we seen here? We've seen Christ continuing his compassion and as Messiah fulfilling prophecy to heal. And he heals but he does so going to the Gentile areas, fulfilling what it says in the Old Testament, that the Gentiles will be included. But he does this again after the Jews. And we'll see this with the Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 1 and 2, to the Jew first, then to the Gentile. I don't think it means that today, but as Paul went out as an extension of Christ's ministry, Colossians 1:24 and 25, he also went to the Jew first initially, and then as part of his ministry, and then to the Gentile. It at least also held true at the initial part of the church. And so he heals, he casts out a demon of the young girl and heals a deaf and dumb man in these Gentile areas of the Phoenician coast and in the Decapolis. Thank you for joining me today. I'll look forward to seeing you next time. We'll start chapter 8.